When the lawyer called to tell me I'd inherited everything, I laughed. It had to be a mistake. The man who spent 20 years telling me I wasn't good enough had left me his entire fortune. But as I sat in his empty mansion, I found the letter. That changed everything. If you've ever felt like you weren't someone's first choice, this story will hit you right in the heart. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss how this incredible story unfolds. Trust me, the ending will leave you speechless. You know that feeling when your phone rings and you almost don't answer? That was me last Tuesday morning. I was rushing to get ready for work, coffee in one hand, trying to find my keys with the other. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and honestly, I almost let it go to voicemail. But something made me swipe to answer. Is this speaking with Jordan Matthews? The voice was formal, professional. A lawyer's voice. Yes, this is Jordan. Who's calling? My name is Mr. Harrison. I'm calling regarding the estate of Robert Matthews. I believe he was your uncle. My heart stopped. Uncle Robert. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 3 years. The last time we talked, it ended the same way every conversation with him did. With him making it crystal clear that I wasn't measuring up to his expectations. I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Matthews passed away last week, the lawyer continued. However, I'm calling because you're named as the primary beneficiary in his will. I actually laughed. Not a happy laugh, but one of those bitter, ironic laughs that escape when life throws you a curveball so wild you can't process it. I'm sorry, did you say primary beneficiary? Are you sure you have the right person? Quite sure. You've inherited the family estate, including the mansion, all investments, and personal belongings. The will is very specific. You inherit everything. I had to sit down. This was Uncle Robert we were talking about. The man who never missed an opportunity to remind me that I wasn't his first choice for anything. The man who always made me feel like I was somehow lacking, somehow not enough. Let me paint you a picture of my relationship with Uncle Robert. From the time I was 7 years old, I knew exactly where I stood in his world, somewhere near the bottom of his priority list. He wasn't a cruel man, not in the obvious ways. He never yelled or hit anyone. But he had this way of making you feel invisible, like you were always just slightly disappointing him by existing. My cousin, Daniel, was everything Uncle Robert wanted in a nephew. Daniel was charming, athletic, confident in that way that comes from never having to doubt yourself. When we were kids, Daniel could do no wrong. He'd break something in Uncle Robert's house, and somehow it became a funny story about boys being boys. I'd accidentally knock over the same lamp, and suddenly it was a lecture about being more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of my surroundings. The worst part wasn't even the favoritism, it was the hope. Because every now and then, Uncle Robert would look at me with something that almost resembled pride. Like when I won the science fair in 8th grade, or when I got accepted to college. For just a moment, I'd think maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time I'd earned his approval, but it never lasted. Within days, sometimes hours, he'd find a way to remind me that I wasn't quite there yet. It's good that you're trying so hard, he'd say. Daniel just seems to have a natural talent for these things. Or my personal favorite, you're not the one I'd choose, but you're doing your best. That phrase haunted me for years. You're not the one I'd choose. He said it about everything. When I chose my college major, when I introduced him to my girlfriend, when I told him about my job. It became his signature response to anything I did with my life. The last real conversation I had with Uncle Robert, Happened 3 years ago at Daniel's wedding. I was 32, finally successful in my career, finally confident in who I was. I thought maybe, just maybe, he might see me differently now. I found him alone on the terrace, nursing a whiskey, and watching the sunset. For a moment, he seemed almost approachable, almost human. "Beautiful ceremony," I said, joining him at the railing. "Daniel's a lucky man," he replied. "Found himself a good woman. She keep him grounded." "Yeah, they seem happy." I paused, then decided to take a risk. "Uncle Robert, I've been thinking about what you said at Christmas, about me not applying myself enough. I got that promotion at work, the one I told you about, senior project manager. They're trusting me with the biggest accounts now." He turned to look at me, and for a second, I thought I saw something soften in his eyes. But then he shook his head. "Jordan, you're a good kid. You work hard, I'll give you that. But working hard and being chosen are two different things. You're not the one I'd choose to lead a team, but I'm glad they gave you a chance anyway." Something broke inside me that night, not dramatically, not with anger or shouting, just quietly, like a thread that's been pulled too tight finally snapping. I realized I'd spent 25 years trying to prove myself to a man who had already decided I wasn't worth choosing. I stopped calling, stopped visiting for holidays, stopped trying to win approval from someone who seemed determined not to give it. And you know what? For the first time in my life, I felt free. Those 3 years of silence were the best years of my life. Without Uncle Robert's constant reminders that I wasn't good enough, I started to see myself more clearly. I was good at my job, really good. My colleagues respected me. My friends enjoyed my company. I was dating someone who actually seemed to like me for who I was, not who I might become if I tried harder. I bought my own house, small but mine. I learned to cook, took up photography, started running marathons. I built a life that felt authentic, that felt like me. For the first time, I wasn't performing for an audience that would never be satisfied. The crazy part is, I rarely thought about Uncle Robert during those years. When I did, it was with a kind of distant sadness, like remembering a friendship that had gradually faded away. I'd hear updates through my mum. He was getting older, slowing down, spending more time alone in that big house. But I'd made my peace with our relationship, or the lack of it. I never imagined that in death, he would force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about us. I never imagined that the man who spent decades telling me I wasn't his choice would make me his only choice when it mattered most. Standing in that lawyer's office, holding the keys to Uncle Robert's mansion, I felt like I was holding puzzle pieces that didn't fit the picture I'd been staring at my whole life. And I had a sinking feeling that once I started putting those pieces together, everything I thought I knew about Uncle Robert and about myself was going to change. The family meeting at the lawyer's office was exactly what you'd expect. Chaos, wrapped in legal formalities. Daniel showed up with his wife and his own lawyer, convinced there had been some mistake. My Aunt Patricia kept asking if Uncle Robert had been of sound mind when he wrote the will. Everyone kept looking at me like I'd somehow orchestrated this whole thing. "This doesn't make sense," Daniel said for the 10th time. Jordan barely even talked to him the last few years. They had some kind of falling out. Mr. Harrison, the lawyer, remained perfectly calm throughout the interrogation. "I can assure you, Mr. Matthews was completely lucid when he drafted this will. He was very specific about his wishes. He even included a provision that if anyone contests the will, they forfeit any right to inheritance entirely. That shut everyone up real quick. But the looks they gave me, like I was some kind of con artist who'd manipulated a dying old man, those looks burned. Because deep down, I was asking myself the same questions they were asking out loud. Why me? Why now? What was Uncle Robert thinking? The lawyer handed me an envelope along with the keys. Mr. Matthews left specific instructions that you should read this alone in his study. He said you'd understand once you did. Walking out of that office, I felt like I was carrying a bomb. Everyone was watching me, waiting for me to explain. Something I couldn't even begin to understand myself. The weight of those keys in my pocket felt heavier than any responsibility I'd ever carried. I'd been inside Uncle Robert's house hundreds of times growing up, but walking through that front door as the owner felt like entering a different universe. The silence was overwhelming. No more of Uncle Robert's classical music playing softly in the background. No more smell of his pipe tobacco drifting through the halls. Just emptiness and the weight of 30 years of memories. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. Isn't that strange how that happens? The grand staircase that had seemed so impressive when I was 8 now just looked like stairs. The dining room, where I'd sat through countless uncomfortable holiday dinners, felt cramped and outdated. But there was something else too. Something I'd never noticed before. Pictures. Everywhere I looked, there were pictures I'd never really paid attention to. And in so many of them, I was there. Me at age 10, gap-toothed and grinning, standing next to Uncle Robert at some family barbecue. Me graduating high school, Uncle Robert in the background, actually smiling. Me and Daniel as kids, building a treehouse that summer I spent here when my parents were getting divorced. I'd always focused on the pictures where I wasn't included. The ones where it was just Daniel and Uncle Robert fishing or golfing or doing whatever it was that uncle and nephew were supposed to do together. But here, scattered throughout his house, was evidence of a relationship I'd somehow forgotten existed. In the living room, on the mantel next to his awards and achievements, there was a small framed photo I'd never seen before. It was me at my college graduation, throwing my cap in the air. I remembered that day clearly. Uncle Robert had been there, but he'd left right after the ceremony. I'd assumed he was bored or had somewhere more important to be. But here was proof that he'd stayed long enough to capture that moment of pure joy on my face. My hands were shaking as I picked up the frame. On the back, in Uncle Robert's careful handwriting, were the words, "Jordan first in the family to graduate with honors. So proud. June 2015. So proud." He'd never said that to me. Not once. But he'd written it down, kept it close enough to see every day. Uncle Robert's study had always been off limits when I was a kid. "That's where your uncle does his important work," my mum would say whenever I tried to peek inside. "Don't bother him in there." Even as an adult, I'd never been invited into that room. It was his sanctuary, his private space where he retreated when family gatherings got too loud or too long. Now, as I turned the key in the lock, I felt like I was violating some sacred boundary. But the room that greeted me wasn't the imposing fortress I'd imagined. It was warm, lived in, filled with books and papers and the comfortable chaos of someone who spent a lot of time thinking. His desk was massive, made of dark wood that had probably cost more than my car. But what drew my attention weren't the expensive furnishings, it was the wall behind his desk. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled not just with the business and philosophy books I'd expected, but with novels, poetry, biographies, and scattered throughout the shelves, more pictures, more evidence of a life I'd never fully understood. There was a photo of him and my father as young men, arms around each other's shoulders, both of them laughing at something the camera couldn't capture. My father had died when I was 15, and I'd never really seen Uncle Robert grieve. But here was evidence of a bond I'd never known existed. And then I saw something that made my heart stop. Sitting on his desk, in a simple silver frame, was my senior portrait from high school. Not Daniel's, mine. The awkward, 17-year-old version of me, braces and all, smiling hopefully at the camera. It was positioned so that anyone sitting in his chair would see it every time they looked up from their work. I sank into his leather chair, overwhelmed by the implications. This wasn't the desk of a man who saw me as a disappointment. This was the desk of someone who kept my teenage face close enough to see every day for 15 years. I wasn't snooping, exactly. I was trying to understand. The desk had 3 drawers on each side, and 5 of them opened icily, revealing the usual office supplies, important documents, business cards. But the bottom right drawer was locked, and something about that lock felt significant. I found the key taped to the underside, off the desk, not hidden exactly, but placed somewhere only someone really looking would find it. My hands were trembling as I turned the key and pulled the drawer open. Inside were journals, dozens of them, leather-bound and carefully organized by year. The earliest one was dated 23 years ago, the year I started high school. The most recent was from just 3 months ago, shortly before Uncle Robert died. I opened the first one randomly, somewhere in the middle, and my own name jumped off the page. Jordan turned 16 today. Watched him blow out the candles and make a wish. He still has that hopeful look in his eyes, like he believes good things are going to happen to him. I hope he never loses that. Daniel's already getting cynical at 14, already assuming the world owes him something. But Jordan still works for what he wants, still believes effort matters. I flipped through more pages, finding my name again and again. Observations about my grades, my friends, my interests, but not the dismissive comments I'd expected. Instead, I found detailed notes about my progress, my struggles, my small victories, like someone was keeping track, paying attention, caring about the details of my life. Jordan made varsity track today. Didn't make a big deal about it at dinner, just mentioned it casually when Patricia asked about school. He's learned not to expect praise, which breaks my heart, but he's also learned not to need it, which makes me proud. Jordan's girlfriend broke up with him today, saw him crying in the garden after dinner, wanted to go talk to him, but he needs to figure out how to handle disappointment on his own. That's a lesson I can't teach him directly. Page after page of observations, insights, worries, and yes, pride. So much pride that had never been expressed, never been shared, never been allowed to reach me. The journals from the last few years were different, less frequent entries, but more reflective, more honest about his own motivations and fears. Haven't seen Jordan in 8 months. He stopped calling, stopped visiting. Part of me wants to reach out, but I know he needs this distance. He needs to prove to himself that he can succeed without my approval, because he can, he always could. Daniel asked me for money again today, 3rd time this month. He's 30 years old and still expects me to solve his problems. Meanwhile, Jordan bought his own house, got promoted again, and hasn't asked me for anything in 3 years. I did something right with him, even if he doesn't know it. Saw Jordan's picture. In the company newsletter, they featured him for leading that big project. He looks confident, happy, like he's finally figured out who he is. That's what I wanted for him, to find his own strength, his own path. I just wish I could tell him how proud I am without undermining everything he's built. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before he died. The doctor says I have maybe a month. I need to make arrangements. Daniel will be angry about the will, but he'll be fine. He always lands on his feet. Jordan will be confused, maybe hurt that I never explained. But he'll understand eventually. He's smart enough to figure out that sometimes love looks like rejection. Sometimes the people we push away the hardest are the ones we're trying to protect. I closed the journal and sat in that chair for what felt like hours, crying for the first time since I'd gotten the news of his death, not crying because I'd lost him. I'd lost him years ago, or thought I had. Crying because I'd never really lost him at all. He'd been there all along, watching, caring, protecting me in ways I'd never understood. That's when I noticed the manila envelope sitting on top of the journals, my name written across it in Uncle Robert's careful script. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in the same handwriting I'd just been reading in the journals. Dear Jordan, it began, if you're reading this, then you found my journals, and you're starting to understand. I hope you'll forgive an old man for taking the coward's way out, explaining myself in death, rather than having the courage to do it while I was alive. The letter went on to explain everything, how he'd watched me struggle with always feeling like I wasn't good enough, how he'd realized that his natural tendency to praise and encourage was actually making me dependent on his approval, how he'd seen what that kind of dependence had done to Daniel, turned him into someone who expected success without effort, who crumbled when faced with real challenges. I made a choice, he wrote, to withhold my approval not because you didn't deserve it, but because I knew you were strong enough to succeed without it. I watched you work twice as hard as Daniel for half the recognition. I watched you pick yourself up from failures that would have destroyed him. I watched you become the kind of person who creates their own validation instead of waiting for someone else to provide it. Every time I told you that you weren't the one I'd choose, what I meant was that you were the one I'd choose to face the world alone. You were the one I'd choose to handle disappointment, to overcome obstacles, to build something meaningful. From nothing, you were always the one I'd choose to carry forward the best parts of our family. The letter explained his will, his reasoning, his hopes for what I would do with the inheritance. But more than that, it explained a relationship I'd never understood, a love that had been expressed through distance, through challenge, through the kind of tough preparation that only someone who truly believes in you would have the courage to provide. I know you'll think this is all convenient rationalization from a man who's too dead to be held accountable, the letter concluded. But look at who you've become, Jordan. Look at the strength you've built, the independence you've earned, the respect you've commanded. You did all of that thinking I didn't believe in you. Imagine what you'll do now that you know I always did. I sat in that study for hours after reading the letter. Watching the sun set through the window Uncle Robert had stared out of 4 decades. The same window where he'd watched me play in the yard as a child, where he'd observed me grow up, struggle, and eventually find my way. All those years, I thought I was invisible to him. Turns out, I was the one person he never stopped watching. The hardest part wasn't forgiving him. It was forgiving myself. For all the years I'd spent angry, feeling rejected, building walls around my heart to protect myself from his disapproval. I'd created an entire identity around being the nephew who wasn't good enough, And now I had to face the possibility that I'd been wrong about everything. I thought about all the times I'd interpreted his silence as rejection. When I graduated college and he left early, I thought he was bored, but maybe he was emotional and didn't want me to see. When I got my first promotion and he barely acknowledged it, I thought he didn't care, but maybe he was trying not to make me dependent on his validation. When I stopped calling him those last 3 years, I thought I was protecting myself, but maybe I was breaking his heart. The journals made it clear that those 3 years of silence had been the hardest for him. Entry after entry showed him wanting to reach out, to congratulate me on achievements he'd heard about through my mother, to offer comfort during difficult times he'd somehow learned about. But he'd held back, convinced that I needed to know I could handle life without his approval. And the terrible irony was that he'd been right. Those 3 years when I thought I was completely on my own were the years I'd become the person I was meant to be. Strong, independent, confident in my own worth. I'd built a life that didn't require anyone else's validation, and that had made me genuinely happy for the first time in my adult life. The next morning, I called everyone back to the lawyer's office. Daniel, Patricia, my mother, even a few cousins, who'd crawled out of the woodwork when they heard about the inheritance. They all showed up expecting me to announce that I was contesting the will myself, that I'd realized this was all some mistake. Instead, I brought the letter. I know you all think Uncle Robert lost his mind when he wrote this will. I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I thought so too. But I spent yesterday going through his things, and I found this. I held up the letter. He wrote this for me, explaining his decision, and I think you all deserve to hear it. Reading that letter aloud was one of the hardest things I've ever done, not because the words were difficult to speak, but because I had to watch the faces of people I loved as they realized what kind of man Uncle Robert really was, and what kind of man they'd assumed he was. Daniel's face went through a whole range of emotions, confusion, anger, hurt, and finally something that looked like recognition. When I got to the part about dependence and independence, about how Uncle Robert had seen the difference between us, Daniel actually nodded, like he'd always known, on some level, that being the favorite hadn't actually been doing him any favors. He was protecting you, Daniel said quietly when I finished reading. From becoming like me. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a kind of tired acceptance. I'm 38 years old, and I've never had to really fight for anything. Everything was just handed to me because I was Uncle Robert's golden boy. But you, you had to earn everything, and look at you now. Patricia was crying. I always thought he was too hard on you, she said. We all did. We thought he was playing favorites, but he was playing a completely different game. My mother was the one who surprised me most. I used to get so angry at him, she admitted. Watching him praise Daniel for things that you did better, I thought, he was blind to your potential. But he saw it before any of us did. He saw it so clearly that he was willing to sacrifice his relationship with you to protect it. Over the next few days, as I continued going through Uncle Robert's papers, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The scholarship I'd received in college that had made my education possible. It had come from an anonymous donor who'd specifically requested that the recipient never be told the source. The reference letter that had gotten me my first job. It had been written by someone who'd described me as one of the most promising young people I've had the privilege to observe, someone who'd clearly been watching my development for years. Even the photography equipment I'd bought myself as A graduation present had been mysteriously discounted at the last minute, marked down to exactly what I could afford on my entry-level salary. I'd thought it was luck. Now I realized it was Uncle Robert pulling strings behind the scenes, making sure I could pursue my interests without ever knowing I was receiving help. He'd been there all along, invisible but present, supporting me in ways that wouldn't undermine my independence. He'd created a safety net so carefully constructed that I'd never even known it existed. The most devastating discovery was a savings account he'd opened in my name when I was 18. Every birthday, every Christmas, every major milestone, he'd deposited money into that account. Not huge amounts, just enough to cover a few months of expenses if I ever found myself in real trouble. The account had been growing for 20 years, and I'd never known about it. The deposit slips told the story of a man who'd been investing in my future even when I thought he'd written me off. Even during those 3 years when we weren't speaking, the deposits had continued, right up until the month before he died. I found myself talking to him in that empty house, having all the conversations we'd never had while he was alive. I told him about my job, my relationship, my dreams for the future. I thanked him for lessons I'd never realized he was teaching. I apologized for staying away, for misunderstanding his love, for not being brave enough to look deeper when his actions didn't match his words. And strangest of all, I could almost hear his responses. Not because I was losing my mind with grief, but because I finally understood how his mind worked. I could predict what he'd say about my fears, my plans, my questions about the future. After 35 years of feeling like I didn't know him at all, I realized I'd been absorbing his wisdom all along. He would have told me that the inheritance wasn't about the money or the house or the possessions. It was about trust. He was trusting me to use everything he'd built wisely to carry forward the values he'd spent decades trying to instill in me. Not through lectures or explicit instructions, but through the gradual, painful process of learning to stand on my own. The house felt different after that realization. Not like a mansion I'd inherited, but like a home I'd been prepared my whole life to care for. The weight of responsibility felt less crushing and more like a natural extension of the independence he'd spent so long helping me build. Daniel and I had coffee the week after the reading. We'd never been particularly close. How could we be when we'd spent our whole lives competing for the same man's approval? But now that we understood the game Uncle Robert had really been playing, we could finally see each other clearly. I envied you for years, Daniel admitted. I know that sounds crazy, given everything, but I envied how hard you worked, how much you seemed to need his approval. I took his praise for granted because it came so easily, but you earned every scrap of recognition you got. I envied you too, I told him. I thought you had everything I wanted. His attention, his pride, his love. But I didn't have his respect, Daniel said. He loved me because I was family, but he respected you because of who you chose to become. We talked about the future, about what Uncle Robert would have wanted for both of us. Daniel was starting to understand that the inheritance wasn't a rejection of him, it was Uncle Robert's. Final lesson: some gifts are meant to challenge us, not comfort us. Daniel's challenge was learning to build something meaningful without a safety net. Mine was learning to accept that I'd been worthy of love and respect all along. 6 months later, I'm still living in Uncle Robert's house. It's my house now, but I think of it as continuing something he started rather than replacing him. I've kept his study exactly as it was, including the picture of 17-year-old me on his desk. Sometimes I sit in his chair and read his journals, trying to understand the man who loved me enough to let me think he didn't. The hardest lesson I'm still learning is how to accept that someone can love you and hurt you at the same time. That the people who push us away aren't always rejecting us. Sometimes they're preparing us for a world that won't always be kind. Uncle Robert knew that life would challenge me in ways he couldn't control, so he made sure I'd be strong enough to handle whatever came my way. I think about him every day, but differently now. Not with the old mixture of longing and resentment, but with gratitude for a love so complex and selfless that it took his death for me to understand it. He gave me the greatest gift anyone can give another person, the knowledge that I'm strong enough to handle life on my own terms. The inheritance isn't really about money or property. It's about understanding that sometimes the people who seem to reject us are actually seeing our potential more clearly than we see it ourselves. Uncle Robert knew I was strong enough to succeed without his approval. The inheritance was just his way of saying that he'd been right about me all along. I still have the letter he wrote me, though I've memorized every word. Sometimes I read it when I'm facing a difficult decision, trying to channel the wisdom of a man who understood me better than I understood myself. The last paragraph is the one that stays with me. You spent your whole life thinking you weren't my choice, Jordan. But you were always my choice for the things that mattered most. You were my choice to handle disappointment with grace. You were my choice to build something meaningful from nothing. You were my choice to carry forward the best parts of our family. You were my choice to become the kind of person who doesn't need choosing, who chooses themselves. I finally understand what he meant. Love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it's fierce and demanding and uncomfortable. Sometimes it looks like rejection when it's actually preparation. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who refuse to make life too easy for us. Uncle Robert's love wasn't the kind that reassured me or made me feel safe. It was the kind that made me strong, and in the end, that turned out to be exactly what I needed. I was never his second choice. I was his choice for a life that would require first choice strength, and that, I'm learning, might be the most profound form of love there is. I want you to close your eyes for just a moment and think about someone in your life who was hard on you. Someone who never seemed satisfied with your efforts. Someone who pushed you when you wanted comfort, who challenged you when you wanted praise. Someone who made you feel like you had to prove yourself over and over again. What if they saw something in you that you couldn't see in yourself? What if their silence wasn't rejection, but protection? What if they loved you so much that they were willing to be the villain in your story so you could become the hero in your own life? I spent 35 years believing I wasn't enough for Uncle Robert. But the truth is, I was so much more than enough that he trusted me with the hardest gift of all, the gift of having to prove my worth to myself, instead of to him right now. Someone watching this video is carrying the weight of feeling unchosen. You're replaying conversations where someone important to you made you feel small. You're remembering moments when their approval felt just out of reach. You're wondering why you're never quite good enough. But what if you are? What if you always were? What if the person who seems to withhold their love is actually giving you something far more valuable, the chance to build strength that no one can ever take away from you? If this story has touched something deep inside you, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button, not just for the algorithm, but as a promise to yourself that you're going to start seeing your struggles differently. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by who chooses them, but by how they choose to respond when they feel unchosen. And please, please tell me in the comments, who in your life loved you in ways you didn't understand at the time, who pushed you to become stronger, who believed in you even when it didn't feel like belief. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Subscribe for more stories that will change how you see love, loss, and the complicated ways people care for each other. Because the most powerful stories aren't fairy tales. They're the real, messy, beautiful truths about how we become who we're meant to be. Before you go, I want you to remember this. If you're watching this and feeling like someone's second choice, like someone's backup plan, like someone who's never quite enough, you might actually be their first choice for something far more important than you realize. You might be their choice for strength, their choice for resilience, their choice for the kind of person who can build something beautiful from nothing. Uncle Robert left me everything he owned, but more than that, he left me the knowledge that I never needed his permission to be extraordinary. And neither do you. Thank you for letting me share the most important story of my life with you. Remember, sometimes being unchosen is just preparation for choosing yourself. And that, my friends, changes everything.